So, we're going to start our afternoon program with our luncheon keynote speaker. And Steve Paley will introduce our keynote speaker. Steve is the co-managing director of the Canada-United States Law Institute. He's held that position since 2022, and he played a major role in putting together this year's conference. And he's also a graduate of Case Law School, class of 2013. In his real world, Steve Paley is the director, compliance risk management at Charles Schwab and Company. So here to introduce our Canadian keynote speaker, Steve Paley.
Thank you, Steve. All right, so on behalf of the Canada-United States Law Institute, it is my pleasure to introduce our conference keynote speaker, Aisha Khan, CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Ms. Khan's illustrious career centers on her unparalleled commitment to promoting and protecting human rights, dignity, and equality in Canada and across the world. Her leadership of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights has promoted awareness and understanding of human rights topics and issues through the important pastime of storytelling and transformational engagement. These initiatives are at the cutting edge of human rights work, particularly in the arts and culture museum experience. In 2023, Ms. Khan told the Winnipeg Free Press, quote, "I hope that people see themselves in the stories we've been entrusted to share. We work with communities across Canada and around the world to care for their stories and share them to inspire a greater understanding of human rights, equity, and inclusion. We're pushing back against outdated ideas of museums as spaces that only display artifacts in glass cases. We want to promote dialogue and reflection about the issues of our time. It's exciting to be a part of that," end quote. Also notable, the Canadian Museum of Human Rights is the only museum in the world dedicated to human rights. They are doing incredible work. Ms. Khan is dedicated to helping build communities where everyone is respected and valued. One might say the golden rule of human rights. The path to human rights is not always clear, but Ms. Khan knew that serving others in the fight against inequality would get her there. At a young age, she witnessed discrimination firsthand, as well as the associated impact of these terrible acts. Ms. Khan started her career journey with an undergraduate degree from the University of Manitoba and a law degree from the University of Victoria. Ms. Khan has worked in private practice in Calgary and led organizational development at the United Way, Winnipeg. A fortunate twist of fate at her daughter's skating lesson, and I think her daughter's here today, where another mother mentioned an open role she knew about, brought her more to her passion for human rights, serving as legal counsel and then as executive director at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, where she tried individual and systemic cases of discrimination and led educational initiatives. In 2019, the Government of Canada appointed Ms. Khan to review solitary confinement conditions in federal penitentiaries. And now from 2020, Aisha is the CEO of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. Ms. Khan's work goes beyond the office. She is deeply engaged in her community, serving on the boards of the Main Street Project and Balmoral Hall School, the President's Advisory Committee at the University of Manitoba, and the Executive Committee of the International Network of Museums for Peace. Ms. Khan has been a heralded keynote speaker at other conferences, including the Winnipeg Women's Conference in March 2023. Ms. Khan has noted that conferences, quote, "can disrupt systems," end quote, and that, quote, "we can make an impact in the world when we work together, when we can share stories of our past to inspire new ways of thinking, interacting, and celebrating one another, and that gives me hope. It's in small moments, just as much as it's in big moves and policies and laws being changed, end quote. We look forward to this moment here today at our Canada-United States Law Conference, where Ms. Khan will give remarks on a topic that fuels her passion for human rights, understanding. It is an honor to have you at our conference, and we look forward to this engaging discussion. And with that, Aisha Khan.
So that's not the bio I sent in. Clearly you do your research. And I've never had the experience of being quoted while I'm in the room. So that was quite interesting. Thank you, everyone. Let's get myself set up. So, thank you for having me here. It is an absolute honor to be here in this room with all of you, to be invited to speak at this conference, and to be able to have spent some time last night and today soaking it up, understanding the issues that we're talking about, and really, I was so moved yesterday with the connections of this particular university to international human rights and the global movement to advance human rights. So thank you. It's a great honor. So a couple of things. One, I love that the room is packed. And so I will always try to get on the lunchtime program because it really fills the room. And so I have no illusions that you're here just to hear me, but I know that the Great Box Lunch will keep you fueled to listen to me for a little bit. I'm going to give some remarks, and then most importantly, I hope that we can have a little bit of a conversation. And so that's Q&A, or it's comments and comments in response. So I'll make sure to leave some time for that. So as you've heard, I guess I find my way into this crowd because I am a lawyer by training. I am in some ways a reluctant lawyer, a person who went to law school because they didn't know what to do with a philosophy degree, got called to the bar because they thought, well, I'm that close to the end of it, I might as well get this part just done to say I did. Practiced in a large national firm in Canada because, well, I guess I should get to know the enemy. And all of these little stories that I told myself through my legal career. I've spent most of my career advocating for human rights against discrimination, and had the unique privilege, I think, of mediating resolutions of discrimination cases with small, medium, and large businesses, and litigating complaints of discrimination as a labor and employment lawyer early on, and then later as senior counsel and at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. Working at a commission, as they're set up in Canada in every province and territory, as part of a larger network of institutions aimed at managing, at dealing, at eradicating discrimination. So these days, I'm CEO at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that because it's part of my own journey as a human rights advocate, and a bit of it's the place where I probably least ever thought that I would be. I remember sitting in it was the pandemic had just kind of started, but we were still going to work, and my former assistant sent me a text message saying, hey, you should apply for this job at the Museum for Human Rights. And I sent her back the emoji with the Zs, like the guy sleeping, and said, museum, snooze fest. And yet here I am, and I am so emboldened by the network of opportunities of the people that I am able to engage in advancing human rights. And so I'm going to reflect a little bit about that. A little bit about me that helps inform how I see the world and the work that I do. My family immigrated to Canada from Pakistan just before I was born. I have to say, I turned 50 a few months ago, and so I'm in this period of reflecting on everything. And I continue to unravel some of the impacts of colonization within my own family, because my parents, now in their early 90s, both left India for Pakistan during the time of partition in 1948. And it's interesting, as I do work in Canada, particularly around decolonizing, uncolonizing, that I think about that within my own family and network. I was born in Winnipeg, Canada. It's the center of Canada, and by that I mean we are truly the center of Canada. So don't let anyone in Toronto or maybe it's London, Ontario tell you otherwise. We are geographically in the center of this great land and the longitudinal center. Just if you need to know, we're right above North Dakota and Minnesota, and so this Midwestern feel at this conference feels pretty familiar to me. Winnipeg is located, as some of you may know, on the traditional lands, traditional Indigenous lands, and the museum in particular is on a very sacred piece of land at the forks of two rivers, the Red and Assiniboine rivers. These are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Ininiwak, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota Oyate, and the Dene Sulene, and it's the homeland of the Red River Métis. Many human rights movements in Canada and in North America were born in this place. The labor rights movement, the initial fight for women to vote. Winnipeg is the center of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and the birth of the Two-Spirit movement within and beyond the LGBTQ plus community. So what a privilege to do human rights from that space. I live on lands that are subject to the first treaty. So now we're going to talk agreements a little bit. But the first treaty between the Government of Canada and Indigenous peoples of those parts, a legal agreement that Canada has interpreted to this day as land that was ceded to them by the First Nations. And though the lawyers in the room will appreciate a legal agreement that has never, in its spirit and intent, been upheld. And that starts my context for my talk with you today. So fantastic conference agenda. This is a lunchtime talk, and I gotta say, I really took it to heart when Stephen Petrus emailed to say, quote, Ms. Khan has much freedom in choosing the focus of her remarks, end quote. So I thought a lot about that. I thought about what would feed you for the rest of this conference, what would make you think differently, what might disrupt what you're otherwise here to do. Thought about what could I share with a room full of government officials, distinguished academics, practitioners, business leaders with illustrious careers in business, international law, and human rights, and a room now full of fantastic legal scholars who are ready to figure out what they're going to do in the world. And I decided that what I can do is I can offer you a lunchtime bit of reprieve, time to reflect a little bit. And I'm going to help you with that by sharing a little bit about what I've been playing around in my head with. So thank you for indulging me. My own reflection takes me to wondering why I've had this love-hate relationship with the legal system, why I've chosen to work within systems that I want to change, and yet why I feel so very comfortable in some human rights circles and I still don't feel like I quite belong in others. What's that about? So I ask you, just take a minute, not a full minute, take a moment. Ask yourself, why do human rights matter to you? And just carry that with you. So I've started to wonder a little bit about how the difference in the answers, in what you're telling yourself in your head, that difference, how is that impacting our ability to collectively advance human rights? All of our individual reasons for what brings us to this work, is it a barrier or is it helping us advance this work together? And frankly, it's the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and ought we not wonder, are we on the path we want to be on? Should we veer right or left? Should we try to fork in the road and go in two ways at the same time? I don't know the answer, but I hope we'll reflect a little on it. So this is where I'm at. Would we be further along in the promotion and preservation of human rights if it didn't feel like human rights were aspirational standards or some kind of prescriptive rights order that's telling us what to do? Think about that. I'm not going to answer a lot of these questions. I'm just going to pose them to you. That's the beauty of reflection. And I don't suggest by any means that abandoning compliance and regulation, lawmaking, legislative policy, development or reform is the answer. I don't think that at all. I think all of the things that we're doing are things that we need to actually double down on. We talked about so many things over the course of the last day and a bit. Implementation matters. We need domestic law. We need to be able to force compliance. But I also wonder, how do we connect that work to the answer that you just gave in your head? My theory is, so I'm just testing it out on you, there is a connection between responsibilities imposed and rights enforced. There is a connection between rights understood and rights lived. And there is room for all of those things. It is a real honor to be here, as I've said, in particular on these lands. And I'd like to acknowledge the first peoples of these lands who cared for it between the Cuyahoga River and the shores of Lake Erie until they were forcibly removed. And I saw it as I read a little bit about this place, a heartening testament to the deep connection between Indigenous peoples and land, that many Indigenous peoples tried to reclaim these lands at various times in history, advocating for millennia for their rights here. And so much gratitude for the Seneca, Shawnee, Wendat, and Miami, and many other Indigenous peoples who make their home here. As many of you know, we're spending time in Canada learning about all the things that I was never taught in school, about the impacts of colonialism in Canada, about intergenerational trauma that impacts much of the almost 2 million Indigenous peoples in Canada today, so we can find our way to reconciliation, to working and living in relationship. So do know that when I start my time with you today with a land acknowledgement, it's not a courtesy. I start my speech today with a land acknowledgement because I am learning the importance of place marking. I am learning from Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers about how people's connection to land is a core part of their identity, and I wish to honor that. Part of my learning as a human rights advocate, and I know for many of you, is to open ourselves to new frameworks, new ways of seeing the world, new knowledge and understanding, so that we can better promote human rights, so that we can better understand how we as humans have lived with each other and ought to live with each other. And I have to say, the connection between colonialism, power, and human rights is not lost on anyone in this room. So I find hope in Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing, and I find comfort in a paradigm of collective responsibility to all living things, including our planet. Maybe there's something there that we can reflect on that will help us answer so many of the questions that have been posed over the last while. So as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have so much to celebrate. And I appreciated some of the comments from the other panelists about all the things that have changed and how we have to have some sense of proportionality. We have to look at how far we've come in so many ways and so many things that we have been able to do through our relationships with one another as countries, in our business relationships, in our human relationships. But if I had to bet, most of us, at some point in the last, let's say, 5 years, or maybe even the last 5 months, have questioned the state of our humanity. It's important to look at how far we've come. Of course it is. It gives us perspective. It's energizing. But I wonder if we are doing a disservice sometimes to our ultimate pursuit of human rights if we don't push ourselves outside the margins of the human rights frameworks, the legal frameworks that we are so used to. Maybe we just need to look at things differently in order to find the same energy, a renewed energy, to work collectively. So, as I said, I'm privileged to work at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. If you've never seen what it looks like or haven't visited, humanrights.ca, it's a pretty fantastic place. It's an iconic Canadian building. It has magnificent architecture designed by an internationally recognized architect, Antoine Predock, who just passed away. It's imbued with meaning in every angle and texture and finish of this building. The spirit of the building lives or is alive, as I am learning, because early on when the museum was built, we were gifted a drum, a grandfather drum from some Anishinaabe elders, and a pipe. And as we've begun to feast that drum in Indigenous ceremony over the last 3 years now, the spirit of that museum has changed. And although it is not a paradigm or a framework that I am familiar with, I have to tell you there's something there. The first museum in the world solely dedicated to human rights with a mandate to explore the subject of human rights, to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, promote respect for others, and to encourage reflection and dialogue. Today we reflect. I know we will dialogue, and that will carry on long after this conference into your cars and airplanes and classrooms as you leave. Article 1, this is the place I get to work. Article 1 of the UDHR hangs on a 40-foot banner over a central space we call the Garden of Contemplation. It's also printed on a 20 by 30-foot wall in our introductory gallery that's called, question, what are human rights? And why? Because by design, human rights mean so many things to so many people. And so in order to better understand human rights, you've got to ask yourself a whole lot of questions about who you are, where you came from, who you are today, and who you feel you should be. It's interesting, the Article 1 is by design placed in a location where on one side there is a timeline of 100 moments of human rights history, those that many of you will be able to recite quite easily. And on the other side is an Indigenous Perspectives Gallery, which through art from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people reminds us about an Indigenous worldview and about the ways in which we are all interrelated. By intent and design, the museum is a place that is to build understanding of human rights, and it does so with its anchor in that Article 1, but really in international human rights law. And so for me, that is the demonstration that we can use our traditional frameworks, but we can build on them, we can push them, we can go outside the margins a little bit and do this work, and that when we do, we are stronger for it, and that we might advance the rights that we hope to in the ways we wish to. So I was appointed in August 2020 to this position. I obviously then did apply after the snooze emoji, and I went through a rigorous process and took the position of CEO August 2020. So 2 months before August 2020, so in June of that year, and before I had got the call that I had this position, I was following my then prospective employer on social media. I was sitting on the couch interviewing guys in prison who hadn't had human contact for more than 4 days and wondering, how could that be? What's going on? What do you need? What's wrong with our system? And And I saw the museum post, an Instagram post, just after the Black Lives Matter rally. George Floyd had just been murdered. So there was a post in solidarity with the movement, as any human rights institution would do. And what followed for the museum that I work at was a public reckoning for the museum. Employees calling it out for anti-Black racism, current employees, former employees, anti-Indigenous racism, and homophobia. Persistent news in Canada, locally where I am for weeks and months, across the country, national news. You can Google it. You'll see tons of articles. Hashtag CMHR Stop Lying. Ironic. A human rights institution that is embedded with pervasive racism and homophobia. And that's only what the review looked into. As that was developing, I was thinking, God, am I going to get a call for this job? Do I want this job? What do I do with this? How do you be a human rights advocate in a system that looks like it's not doing a very good job? But what I heard made me double down on my desire to get that call. It was the belief that human rights are the inalienable rights that we are born with. They are not aspirational, they are foundational, they are universal, they are expected to be upheld. That, I believe. That means we can change this system. And that made me want to go and do the work that I do. Just by the way, I was so pleased to get the small, the Universal Declaration booklet, and it made me think about the other part of Article 1 that nobody talks about quite as much. Not only are human beings born free and equal in dignity and rights, they're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Why don't we talk about that? Maybe you do. I haven't been talking about that. Those are powerful attributes we hold. And I have to say that it's really in the moments that I have felt the most confidence that we as humans are connected and that we see our shared humanity. It's in those moments that we exercise our reason and our conscience, and you can feel it. So back to human rights law. The learning for me has been that to push myself into a multidisciplinary environment of social justice and human rights advocates and activists is powerful. The underpinnings of human rights law and principles are sometimes dismissed as weak, as flowery, as aspirational, or just talk. Quick sideline. I was speaking to a bunch of junior high students. It was for International Women's Day. I was at an assembly talking in front of, I don't know, hundreds of students, and I was surprised that they were even listening. Did my thing, and afterwards they could ask questions, and there were so many questions, and the questions were hilarious. Like, some of the questions were, what's your new exhibit? Some were like, how'd you meet your husband? I challenged, how do you know that I even have a husband? Why would you assume that? All sorts of questions. Do you like your job? And then one kid stands up, he was in grade 7, and he said, are we even really doing anything? Like, what are human rights even doing? It seems like it's just talk. Like, why is nothing changing? And he started to recite, what about Yemen? What about Congo? What about Darfur? What about Ukraine? What about Palestine? And I was kind of floored. A 12-year-old calling me out to say, do human rights even matter? And I'm supposed to be the inspiring speaker. The other moment that I kind of have been carrying with for a month or so is, as I walked out of that assembly, a little girl stopped me, and she was so cute, and she said, I wanted to ask you a question, but I didn't get a chance. And her friends were kind of giggling in the corner, like waiting while she asked me this question. I said, yeah, for sure, what is it? And she said, how many times have you wanted to give up hope? And so I answered almost kind of flippantly and said, oh, come on, how many times do you want to give up hope when you're studying? All the time. But, I gave her some encouraging words about how we talk to ourselves and we encourage ourselves to keep working. And as we continued to walk out, she said something about how she'd been to the museum for a rally that was held there around marking the anniversary of the war, the invasion of Ukraine. And I said, oh, so your family's Ukrainian? And she said, yeah, the other half of my family is Palestinian. I said, have a great day. I said, I hope your family's okay. And I walked away. And I thought in that moment, I'm talking about exhibits and education and human rights frameworks. And this is a young person, probably 12 years old, that is living the impacts of human rights, who's trying to make sense of what they mean, who's trying to look for some inspiration in the frameworks that we have set up and that we celebrate and use to advance human rights. Most of you have illustrious careers. You've done and are doing amazing things in academia, in research, in convening people, in pushing important human rights issues. I think that the work that we must do, that work is work we must do and we must stay on top of, and work that we have to bring others into. And I'm super thankful again for the law students to be here. But I gotta say, I challenge those around me to see human rights as fundamental in the way that they were intended. And I often wonder, do you as well? We know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the only universal declaration. It was intended to set out fundamental rights of humans, how they ought to treat one another. We know where it came from and we know why we needed it. And yet we still talk about it, like I've heard people talk about it as a North Star, as something we should strive for, somewhere we should get to. Maybe that's what's messing with us. The most basic, the very basic principles of human rights, that we all have inherent worth and dignity. We're born with it. It is so simple. It is so pure. And maybe the advancement of human rights is to have people see that we can come back to that fundamental principle. That it's not a linear journey to get there. It's just coming back full circle to who we are and how we ought to be. So, if we did it that way, might we look at the infringements of rights and remedy a little differently? You know, I recall advocating for a person who's a person with very significant disabilities who had brought a complaint of discrimination against our city. And we were crafting I was crafting the argument for the closing of the case. You know, I thought that we had this one in the bag, and I had to talk about remedy. And so, of course, I had to think about quantitatively, what is the injury to your dignity, feelings, and self-respect, as it is contained in our domestic human rights law. And he turned to me and he said, I don't want any money for dignity, for infringement of dignity. My dignity's just fine. This isn't my problem. I've held my dignity since the day I was born. And I looked at him in that moment and I thought, but you could get like tens of thousands of dollars. Like, surely we did this, obviously not for the money because it's never worth it, but that is part of the framework. We need to hold someone to account. They need to pay some money for this. They need to compensate you for what they've done to you. And he said, I don't want it. I have my dignity. And in that moment, I wondered, are the frameworks that we've set up for ourselves sometimes a bit off? Do they not fit us in the same way, or ought we just think about them differently? Our rights framework requires me to see that the marginalization of the individual is compensable and controllable. And it didn't give me much hope, and it didn't give him any either. So, every human being is born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is the knowledge that made every case I've ever litigated a really easy one. Every argument a simple one. Every kitchen table conversation or conversation with someone who you're having a bit of a something with, an easy one. How can you not get behind that? Aren't we all born free and equal? Are we not all deserving of dignity and respect? But I think I think about how simple that is, and then how abstract human rights are, how people don't understand them, how we've given them meaning based on our profession, our regulatory environment, that sometimes misses the mark, and that there's so much room for us to do to actually understand those fundamental principles. And then our job, before we even can convince everybody else out there to believe in human rights, to advance them, to protect and uphold them, is for us to truly understand why we're doing this work. What does it actually mean, and how does it connect to the intent of why we needed a universal declaration in the first place? If we understand human rights in this way, they no longer feel that abstract and ephemeral. They're at our core, like all beliefs that touch us, our hearts, our minds. And so while we entrench them in law and treaty and declaration, to help us frame the system we want to live and work and play in and to guide our behavior, maybe it's guiding our behavior more than prescribing it. Looking at human rights in this way for me, exposes the influence of power. And so I'm back to colonialism, so I digress. The museum gives me a unique view into human rights because we see it through the eyes of visitors, tens of thousands, millions of people who come through and learn about human rights atrocities, genocides, the Holocaust, I can go on, the Rohingya crisis, all of the human rights stories that you know. And they learn about those, but what they also learn is to think for themselves, to recognize injustice, to make the connection between one atrocity to one over here. So when people say to me, and my inbox is daily full with people saying, why aren't you telling this story, or why didn't you tell it this way, or you missed this fact? The internet is great for having your email address out there for the public. I've begun to respond, and I don't respond to all of them, but I've begun to respond generally with the idea that if you understand the infringement of human rights in one place, if you truly understand it at a very human level and connect to what has happened there, what we have done wrong as humans, you should be able to apply those principles to every other human rights atrocity that you see or recognize, or every other form of injustice. And so we have a program called Be an Upstander, and we're teaching young kids to recognize injustice, to realize they have tools, and to do something with them. So that's this great place where I get to work. But let me just talk a little bit about the state of the world, and then I'm going to come back to my final point in my theory. The world's a pretty messy place. You know, all of what I'm saying, it sounds kind of heartwarming, perhaps even naive. We should feel connected. We are connected. Human rights are from the heart. It doesn't really seem like it accounts for some of the legendary events that we've seen in the last 50 years in human rights history and around the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of economic globalization, the end of apartheid in South Africa, greater vaccination and health equity. We're narrowing the pay gap between men and women, more women in science, greening solutions, LGBTQ2+ rights celebrated, and I could go on. That heart stuff doesn't really seem to account for all these great strides and milestones that we've hit, does it? But maybe it does. Or maybe if we looked at it that way, there would be so many more milestones to celebrate. You know, you might have heard this idea of the polycrisis or the perma-crisis shared at the World Economic Forum last year, the idea that there are multiple crises going on in the world and they're having compounding effects on us. Inflation, cost of living, trade wars, widespread social unrest, geopolitical confrontation, and, you know, obviously the threat of nuclear warfare. We've got threats to democracy like we've never seen before. You know, I was interested that in 2024 there were elections, or 2023 there were elections in 64 countries around the world. And then, of course, post-COVID, we're all looking at the state of the world and the recognition of individual freedom. I think there's a question this morning about freedoms, right? And individual rights seems to be a hot topic for free speech. We've got older demographics. Lots of aging people, and we have massive migration on the globe, around the globe. 1 in 8 people around the globe are on the move. And I'm not going to talk about why. And then let's just talk about communication. So social media has changed the way in which the world connects, the way humans connect. And of course, we have great polarization. And if you haven't thought about that lately, I know you'll think about it as soon as you pull up your news or look at a newspaper. We are so polarized in the way that we think about some of the very core issues that matter to human rights and that understanding of shared humanity. So human rights are under attack. This is the grim part. I'm going to pull you up. Talk to your teenagers, scroll your feed. The social model of human rights has changed, perhaps more than the legal model, and it's making havoc in our world. We've got activism, cancel culture, protests, and rallies amongst a web of people behind keyboards, warriors who may never see the people whom they are arguing with. And it is creating a havoc at a level that is something we have to pay attention to. And so the state of our work, how we can ignore the impacts these things have on, how can we ignore the impacts that these things have on our ability to do our work, to stick to our framework, to connect with our heart, to be better humans to one another in business relationships and all relationships? I don't know. But enforcement, forcing it down people's throats, and I have to tell you, and I don't mean that that's what enforcement is, but the idea that when rights are imposed and you are shamed into being a better human, there has to be research on the psychology underneath that. I got to tell you, I often speak because I often speak about equity and diversity and inclusion, and I speak to rooms full of people, and I can see on the faces in the room the people who get it and the people who don't. And I wonder, the people who don't, because you can read their facial expressions, they still came. And so that's what heartens me. They came to learn, and they came to be open to a new way of thinking. And so if I think about it in that context, our human rights work, both through international instruments and how we impose them, has to be infused with the idea that we must connect as humans and we must truly understand why we are doing the work and why it matters. Deterrence, enforcement of paradigms that are put on top of us have a role. I think compliance is absolutely important. And again, I don't mean to say that we should not, particularly at the international level, be using those forms, but we should couple them in our daily interactions with an understanding. Because if we do both of those things simultaneously, maybe we will have greater impact in terms of achieving the human rights that we desire. A quick word about trust, because I think there's a lot of trust underlies a lot of the way that we are working as humans. And when I think about that social crisis, the perma-crisis, I think about trust. And, you look at Edelman's Trust Barometer. The report for 2024 told us a bunch of interesting things about the decline of authority, the trust in companies from global powers is in decline. There's worry about societal threats and leadership. Governments are seen as far less competent and ethical than business. Peers are as trusted as scientists for information on new innovations. What? In Canada, trust for business is growing, but not in the Indigenous population. And get this, online searches seem to rank highest in terms of how people find information they can trust. I'm sure universities are reeling with these stats. And that's just trust. At the museum, we commissioned a study last year to explore the awareness, attitudes, and activism around human rights in Canada. I was happy to say 66% of people said they trusted museums, and 80% in my home province. So we just made some lines that, of course, that's because of us. But what we do know is that for human rights information, the majority of people are relying on nonprofits, teachers, human rights advocacy groups, and international government organizations. Get this, almost equally as they are relying on word of mouth. Okay, so that's a little baffling to me. And what it means for me is that we've got to manage that word of mouth. We have work to do in that world of word of mouth. That is about our human connections. That is about our understanding and how we express it to others outside of our jobs, outside of our classrooms, outside of our research papers. 72% of people told us, or 72% of the people that we surveyed across the country rely on family, friends, and community members. That's who they trust. So there's where our work is. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights gives us a pathway to work with those people. It gives us the pathway to build connection with one another, to understand our shared humanity. And so there's work there. So I don't think that trust is going to give us to this world of lived human rights, but I do think understanding will. I won't go through all the stats because I'd love to talk to you more just about what your reaction is. But I have to say, it's quite interesting. So this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Only 27% of respondents said that they had heard of it, but they weren't sure what it said. 49% had never heard of it, and only 6% had read it and generally knew what it said. 18% weren't sure, so I don't even know if they knew what it was. Even that it was a broad survey across Canada. It was only some, I think it was 3,000 people, so it was just a sampling, of course, and wasn't meant to be a statistically sound survey other than to be a pulse check on, for our museum, on where are people at? What are they thinking? What do they know? What do they think about? So I was happy to hear that that there's going to be another study. I think it was Mr. Brandt talked about doing a study in the US. So what was heartening was that when people were asked, one of the questions was heartening to me was that when people were asked about being able to spot injustice, the majority of the people said that they could spot injustices and violations and they're confident to speak up and know what to do. All these stats don't make sense to me. On the one hand, our world is we're advancing, we're in chaos, but people understand, but people don't know what the UDHR is. And so isn't it our job then, as human rights defenders, as human rights advocates and activists, and everyone in this room is one of those. I know that, because I know you answered the question at some level with some connection to human rights. Isn't our job then to make sure that we connect those frameworks to one another, and rather than impose a framework in one way and talk about we've come this far but we have more work to do, we also do this other human heart work of building an understanding of human rights. If we do that with our young people, ought we not do it with the people that we work with, the people who we sit at the kitchen table with? So back to my idea. When rights frameworks feel like they are imposed on us, they're prescribed, they're required, they're forced, it's an or else, they can be limiting and they can often feel oppressive. And they can also be counter to the idea of building an understanding, because to do that, you need vulnerability, you need safety. If you really don't understand why it matters, you got to do some personal reflection and you have to be able to work that through. Have we, as human rights advocates, international law experts, somehow unknowingly disassociated ourselves from the movements that are connecting the populace? Is it okay? So when the state of the world looks as it does, and people are being canceled out, and there's human rights activism abounds in social media or otherwise, is the framework that we're using completely separated from that? And if it is, then how are we building a collective sense of responsibility? Our own understanding is important. And that understanding means that in any way that it suits us, we need to think about, reflect on why we do human rights work. Why does human rights matter? Why does it matter to me? That is an individual, intimate, personal journey. But I have to think that if we did that, we might bring more of ourselves into this work, and we might have a better chance of connecting humanity in the way that Article 1 of the Universal Declaration suggests that we might, and frankly prescribes that we ought to. Every person that I've advocated for, every conversation that I've explored with that person about their raw pain or their discomfort or the infringement of their rights, sort of reminded me that we are all connected, that we are always one generation, one paycheck, one moment away from a life of rights lived with less dignity. So for me, it's the stories that we tell ourselves that are important. It's the stories that we tell each other. And when I think about myself, I think about the stories that I've told myself for years, that I wasn't discriminated against enough. I haven't really known what it feels like to feel racism. I actually do belong, and it's not like so-and-so. The guilt and the shame that comes from saying that we are not the ones to tell the story. I got to tell you, we're all the ones to tell that story. And so rather than feeling some kind of guilt or competition between human rights issues and people, what if we just thought about, we all have a personal journey, we all have our own, we bring our experiences, lived experience into the room, into the world, into the workplace. And if we take that as the bottom and help then to work to push those paradigms, the ones we've talked about, international law is a pretty, is a framework that we are not to abandon. In fact, we need to put more energy, more lived experience, and more effort into those systems if we're going to make the advances we wish. We still have some personal work to do. And so, why do human rights matter to you? I encourage you to think about it, answer it in your head, tell your friends, don't tell anyone, mull it over, but think about it. How do you live them every day? How do you ensure that human rights are practiced and don't need to be enforced? Because I think you probably can think of some examples. How do you promote our shared humanity? And is it through your study, your teaching, your negotiation, your innovation, your advocacy? Do your motivations that bring you here reflect a collective view of human rights, or are we working in a system, despite its immense influence in our world, that's not able to sustain the prevailing views that are around us, that chaos we talked about? So, what if we stepped away from our traditional rights framework, didn't abandon it, but stepped away and did some personal work and brought it back into the fold, into this work? Where would we be? Do we have that collective view? And is maybe that where we ought to spend some time? You got long bus rides and car rides and plane rides home to where you come from, I'm sure, and there's room to muse a little bit. So thank you for indulging me. I have to say, I wonder how far we'd be. I wonder what the conversation will be like when it's the 80th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With a world in chaos as it is today, in so many ways, despite all the great strides that we've been, perhaps that personal reflection is what we need to do it a little bit differently and get to the place that we all want. Thank you for indulging me. Any questions? I would be happy to answer. Oh, no.
You shall take the dean's prerogative and ask the first question. First of all, thank you so much for an extremely inspiring and thought-provoking speech. What a great speech. And a lot of the people here are my students from our first year international law class, and I think they benefited a lot from it. So you talked a bit about land acknowledgements. And if you get a chance to go back to our law school, you'll see that the graduating class last year created a land acknowledgement post that we have in our courtyard for the very tribes that were chased out, expelled from this area. There's a big debate in Ohio that you may or may not know about, and that is that there is a national park, and the National Forestry Department wants to rename it. It's currently named Wayne National Park. They want to rename it Buckeye National Park. Now, the history, just briefly, is that after the United States became independent, George Washington sent General Anthony Wayne up to this area with the instruction to clear out the Native Americans so that we could settle it. And he wrote back to George Washington and said, the only way I can do that is to burn them out and destroy all their homes and farms and completely devastate them. And George Washington said, I authorize you to do that. And he did. So that's the history behind wanting to rename the park. Our newest senator, J.D. Vance, says, hey, Anthony Wayne is to Ohio what George Washington is to the country. I will not let you rename the park. So it's a huge debate right now. How would you instruct or advise our students and our citizens to think about that issue?
It's a great question. And those debates are happening in and around where I am and all around Canada as well. So a couple of things. If we truly work in a system, and we do live in a system, then I think most importantly, it's important for us to not make decisions about Indigenous peoples without Indigenous peoples. I have learned my perspective. I'm a human rights advocate. I understand the history of colonialism. I want to do better and I want a better world. But it is only by being in relationship with Indigenous colleagues, learning from elders, opening myself up to ideas that I didn't understand, Indigenous ways of thinking and knowing, and it's not linear always, that I've begun to better understand what is the right path. What is the decision to be made? And, it seems trite, but if, in human rights, we always talk about nothing about us without us, right? So there's that in terms of just how one ought to make decisions. But in terms of thinking about it, I think often a lot about human rights heroism. A lot of people there's human rights awards. I've been part of them. They're given out. Talk about the museum, and the more that I think about heroism in human rights, it doesn't quite fit. Because who really is a hero? You're a hero in one aspect of your life, but you do horrible things in another. And if we started to recognize that all human beings are imperfect, and it doesn't mean that people who've done egregious things should not be called out for egregious things, maybe we'd look at things differently. Maybe it wouldn't be so simple that this person was like this and now they're like that. In the museum, there's an area where we have honorary people who've been given honorary citizenship to Canada, and one of them is Aung San Suu Kyi. And so some years ago, it was great controversy in a museum world where it takes a long time to make decisions and do things. How could we celebrate her? And so we dimmed the lights. It's a lit up big photo thing, and we dimmed the lights because we didn't want to get rid of it, because people also needed to know how we change our thinking about things that have happened in history and over time. And there's lessons that we learn from the past. So I would encourage you to stop where your heart goes sometimes, to say, this is how it ought to be. To stop and pause and listen to whose perspectives are, if it's being made around the table, at the table. And to think about who true heroes are. What does it mean to be a hero? And how do we reconcile the heroes that then really make us feel horrible about the things that they've done when we learn of them later? And I think we can think of many, many people who've done amazing things, but who've also at the same time done horrible things to other humans. So perhaps that might help. Can't answer the question, though, and I'm not getting into the naming debate.
Hi, thank you for the inspiring talk. I'm curious how the museum's dealing with the issue of asylum rights and immigrant rights. And part of your conversation almost implies there's a tension, right? I mean, part of the reason Indigenous people had a problem is that you had a migration, some of it for political reasons, some of it just for better economic hopes of the immigrants. And so, and even here in the United States now, there's a lot of tension in terms of, should these people be coming in? Some of them are trying to counter human rights abuses in their countries, but a lot of them are coming here for a better life. And the people who are here, some of them, working class people are saying, well, if we let all these people in, it's going to suffer our well-being. We're not going to be able to deal with the issues we have to deal with our own population. And so it seems to me a human rights museum probably has to grapple with those issues, especially asylum rights and immigrant rights. And you mentioned 1 in 8 people are migrating right now. So I was just curious how the museum is framing that issue and discussing that issue, especially in light of its impact perhaps on Indigenous rights as well.
Yeah, great question. I mean, the short answer is I don't think that we've done enough around migrant rights. I mean, we do tell some stories about migrant rights and some of the history in Canada. Many of the stories. So you hear the stories of Canada's past. We're a National Museum of Canada, but we haven't shied away from many of those stories about, Japanese internment during the Second World War, or Chinese head tax and those kinds of things. But those are historical, so they're kind of put in place, and there's government apologies that kind of make them okay to talk about in those ways. When I think about some of what you surfaced, which is the immigration is squeezing people out of jobs and things like that. And I go now just to my personal thoughts on it, so not the museums, but I'll say I think it's driven by fear. I mean, if you look at, I'm a first-generation Canadian. And if I look around, my peers, many of them are first-generation Canadians from countries around the world, and it tracks perfectly with the immigration patterns in Canada. And we're taking up space because we've been educated here, and we're doing the things, and we have the same opportunities, and human rights means that there's an equality of opportunity. And so there is tension. There's tons of tension. And I think it's driven by fear. It's loss of power and loss of control. And I think the only way for us really to get through that fear and get through that tension, and this is the way of thinking about it more than an actual practical solution, I think it's to go back to that first principle. We all deserve a life of dignity, whether it's here or there. I'll give you an example when you talked about Indigenous rights. So in Canada, it's a couple of years now, and you will know that the discovery for some of 215 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school really shook our country, shook some of our country. For some folks, it was the knowledge that there was such a thing. For many, it was we've been advocating and telling you this story for years and years and years, and nobody ever listened. So it still shook us. And so Canada Day that year was Canada, July 1st, we celebrate Canada. It's a bit of a somber day for many. The next year, and here at the museum, we used to, light up the tower, and we had a Canada Day celebration. And the next year, we talked about it again. We said, well, what do we do this year? There's still, it seems almost, I'm not even giving it justice, but it's there's much to do on that front to build an understanding of the harms of colonialism in Canada, and I know that extends into the States. But then there was another view, which was, but what about all the people who came to Canada who want to celebrate being in Canada because they've come from, as you say, from war-torn countries, they've come as refugees and asylum seekers, and how do we reconcile that Canada can be amazing, wonderful place of refuge for some, and a place with a dark history and past? And I actually went and spoke with we have an elder in residence, and I sat with him and I said, what do you think we should do? And it was the grace in that moment that he gave us to say, we can be all of these things at the same time. We can hold two truths and move forward. It gave me the confidence to say that we don't always have to have the right answer. There isn't one way of doing it, but there is a place for understanding in the middle. And so I haven't really answered your question about what the museum is doing about migrant rights, but I hope I've given you a way of thinking about the tension and where it comes from, and maybe a different way that we can look at it. And it kind of speaks to the heroism conversation, that countries are imperfect as well, and they need to redress and address. But we have to understand them in the complexity and nuance of human rights. It's not simple stuff. It's fundamental. It's simple in its principles. But in its application, it is amongst the more nuanced and complex area of application of law that I have seen. Thank you very much.